There is a strange irony at the center of North America's latest trade conflict. At a time when the United States desperately needs millions of new homes, Washington has chosen to make one of the most important building materials more expensive. And at a time when Canada depends heavily on the American market for its forestry sector, Ottawa is being forced to rethink decades of economic integration with its largest trading partner. What began as another chapter in the long-running softwood lumber dispute has evolved into something much bigger, a battle over supply chains, housing affordability, economic sovereignty, and the future of North American trade itself. A trade relationship built over generations. For decades, Canadian lumber has been woven directly into the foundation of the American housing market. The average U.S. single-family home requires roughly 15,000 board feet of framing lumber. Every wall, roof, floor system, and structural frame depends on a steady flow of wood products. For generations, a significant portion of that supply has crossed the border from Canada. This wasn't an accident. Canada possesses enormous forest resources, highly developed sawmill infrastructure, and transportation networks specifically designed to serve American builders. Meanwhile, U.S. domestic production has rarely been sufficient to satisfy total housing demand. Over time, a deeply interconnected system emerged. American builders relied on Canadian lumber. Canadian mills relied on American buyers. Both countries benefited, until politics intervened. The return of an old fight. The softwood lumber dispute is older than many of the workers currently employed in the industry. Since the early 1980s, American lumber producers have argued that Canada's system of publicly owned forests gives Canadian companies an unfair advantage. Because Canadian provinces set stumpage fees for harvesting timber on Crown land, U.S. producers claim those fees amount to government subsidies that distort competition. Canada has consistently rejected that argument. From Ottawa's perspective, stumpage fees are simply part of a legitimate public resource management system and not an export subsidy. Yet neither side has ever truly resolved the disagreement. Instead, the dispute follows a familiar cycle. The United States imposes duties. Canada challenges them. Temporary agreements are negotiated. Agreements expire. The fight begins again. For over 40 years, this cycle has repeated itself. But 2025 marked a dramatic escalation. Trump's national security argument. The turning point came when President Donald Trump launched a Section 232 investigation into lumber imports under the national security provisions of U.S. trade law. That decision fundamentally changed the nature of the dispute. This was no longer merely an argument about subsidies. It became a question of national security. The administration argued that domestic lumber production was strategically important and that foreign dependence posed long-term risks to American supply chains. The result was a new layer of tariffs imposed on top of existing anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Suddenly, Canadian lumber entering the United States faced combined import costs exceeding 45%. That number changed everything. Because when tariffs approach half the value of a product, they stop functioning as a modest trade correction. They become a major economic shock. The immediate consequence: more expensive homes. Supporters of the tariffs framed them as a victory for American producers. But America's homebuilders saw something very different. The National Association of Homebuilders warned that the new duties would raise construction costs and ultimately increase housing prices. According to industry estimates, tariffs added roughly $1,000 to the cost of a new home. That might not sound catastrophic in isolation, but consider the broader environment. Mortgage rates remained elevated. Land costs were already high. Labor shortages continued to plague construction. Millions of Americans were struggling to afford homes. Adding another $1,000 to construction costs was like throwing gasoline onto an already raging fire. The impact became visible quickly. Housing starts weakened. Builders delayed projects. Developers became more cautious. At precisely the moment America needed an acceleration in housing construction, policy choices pushed in the opposite direction. The supply problem. Nobody could solve. The central flaw in the tariff strategy was simple. Even if tariffs successfully reduced Canadian imports, America could not instantly replace them. Canadian lumber accounts for approximately 85% of U.S. softwood lumber imports and nearly 1/4 of total American supply. That dependency did not emerge because of laziness or bad policy. It emerged because the United States simply did not have enough sawmill capacity. Industry data showed domestic mills operating far below the levels needed to replace Canadian imports in the near term. Expanding capacity requires billions in investment and years of development. Trade policy can create shortages overnight. It cannot create sawmills overnight, and that mismatch became increasingly obvious as lumber prices climbed. Canada's forestry sector takes the hit. While American consumers faced higher prices, Canadian communities experienced something even more painful: job losses, mill closures, economic uncertainty. The forestry industry in British Columbia was already facing structural challenges from wildfires, insect infestations, Indigenous land agreements, and shrinking harvest volumes. The tariff shock pushed many struggling operations over the edge. Major mills closed. Production was cut. Thousands of workers faced uncertainty. Entire towns built around forestry began questioning their future. For large cities, a mill closure may appear as a statistic. For a small resource community, it can be an economic earthquake. When a sawmill shuts down, the damage extends far beyond the plant gates. Truck drivers lose contracts, equipment suppliers lose customers, restaurants lose patrons, local governments lose tax revenue, schools lose families. The entire economic ecosystem begins to weaken. Mark Carney's strategic response. Prime Minister Mark Carney responded with a broader vision than simply defending lumber exports. His government framed the crisis as evidence that Canada had become too dependent on a single customer. The solution, according to Ottawa, was diversification. Several measures followed: financial support programs for forestry companies, loan guarantees and industry stabilization funds, Buy Canadian procurement policies, efforts to expand access to Asian and European markets, new trade discussions beyond North America. The message was clear. If access to the U.S. market could no longer be assumed, Canada would need to reduce its economic vulnerability. Why diversification is harder than it sounds. Many commentators assume Canada can simply redirect lumber exports elsewhere. Reality is far more complicated. Canadian lumber is primarily manufactured according to North American specifications. Different countries use different standards, different dimensions, different building codes, different logistics networks, different customer expectations. A shipment intended for Texas cannot necessarily be redirected to Germany or Japan without adjustments. Diversification is possible, but it takes years, not months, and certainly not weeks. That means Canadian producers remain heavily exposed to decisions made in Washington. The housing crisis gets worse. The most striking contradiction in the entire dispute may be what it reveals about American housing policy. The United States faces a housing shortage measured in millions of homes. Industry estimates place the deficit near 5 million units. Every policy discussion eventually arrives at the same conclusion. America needs more housing supply. More homes require more lumber. Yet tariffs deliberately made a critical housing input more expensive. The policy was designed to protect producers, but the economic burden fell largely on consumers. That tension sits at the heart of the controversy. Who should policy prioritize? The producers of lumber or the families trying to buy homes? The Trump administration chose one answer. Many homebuilders chose another. The bigger geopolitical shift. What makes this dispute especially significant is that it extends beyond lumber. The fight has become symbolic of a larger transformation occurring across North America. For decades, economic integration between Canada and the United States was treated as permanent, predictable, unshakable. Today, that assumption is being questioned. Tariffs on lumber, tariffs on steel, trade disputes over EVs, USMCA uncertainty. All of these developments send the same signal. Cross-border economic relationships can no longer be taken for granted. As a result, Canada is increasingly exploring alternatives. Not because replacing the U.S. is easy, but because relying entirely on a single market now appears riskier than it once did. The real winners and losers. The tragedy of this dispute is that both countries are paying a price. Canada loses jobs, investment, and market access. The United States faces higher building costs, reduced housing affordability, and continued supply shortages. Neither side emerges completely victorious. Instead, the biggest winners may be a relatively small group of protected producers, while the costs are dispersed across millions of consumers and workers who rarely appear in trade negotiations. Final analysis. The lumber war is often portrayed as a simple fight over unfair trade. It is not. It is a collision between two competing visions of economic policy. One vision prioritizes domestic industrial protection. The other prioritizes affordable access to critical goods. The United States chose protection. Canada chose resistance. The result has been higher costs, lower certainty, damaged communities, and a widening crack in one of the world's most important trading relationships. And perhaps the most important lesson is this. You can impose a tariff with the stroke of a pen, but you cannot rebuild supply chains, construct new sawmills, create affordable housing, or replace decades of economic integration nearly as quickly. That is why the consequences of this dispute will likely outlast the politicians who started it, and why the true cost of the lumber war is only beginning to be understood.